Welcome, everybody, to Understanding the Human Condition. I'm Dr. James Flowers, your host, and I'm super excited today to welcome Marc Kantor from South Florida, from Boca Raton. Marc, welcome. I'm so glad that you had time and carved it out to be here with me today.
No, this is a real honor for me. I was looking forward to this.
Good. I'm super
Yeah.
happy about that. I just want to read a little bit of a bio, but I really want you to really introduce yourself. But I have some few things I want to say. Marc, of course, everybody knows that he's a professionally trained addiction and mental health interventionist. Marc is also the author of the book, How to Do an Intervention, a step-by-step guide for parents, and he's also the founder of South Florida Intervention. Marc is a native of Long Island and a graduate of American University, and he spent 20 years in commercial real estate in New York and Washington, D.C. before making a significant career shift, which I hope to talk to Marc about and why that shift happened. And most recently, something I'm super excited to announce here on our podcast at J Flowers is that Marc has also joined, in addition to his intervention practice, Marc is going to be doing some representation out in the world of J Flowers Health Institute right here in Houston. So we're super excited about that, Marc.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
So thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely. The first thing I'd like to talk about, since I said talking about you being an interventionist, is why don't you talk about what is an interventionist and what do you do as an interventionist and how do interventions impact the human condition?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. So an intervention is, in a way, it's an organized conversation that is choreographed. As an interventionist, I am a choreographer of the intervention, and surprisingly, my role can be quite little when it comes to the intervention. I always say if I've done my preparation work with the family the right way the day before, and sometimes I'll spend an entire day with the family, and we'll talk about all kinds of things. We'll talk about, how we sit, who reads, in what order, and boundaries, and how do we de-escalate. If I've done my work correctly, then the next day, the intervention, which I usually do early in the morning, I should be doing very little.
Okay.
I should just be filling in some blanks, doing very little. But now that I think about it, intervention is it's not necessarily the intervention on the individual, it's the intervention on the family. Because as you know, we just talked about, unless the whole family system makes a shift, really nothing's going to happen. It's not good enough to just get an individual into treatment and say, oh, good, they're there for 30, 60, 90. Real change has to take place for this to work.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm so glad to be talking about interventions and the way that you prepare. As you said, you prepare for the intervention the day before, or even probably several days before.
Sure.
What do you do, Marc? Because you and I both get these phone calls, and every interventionist I know gets these phone calls from time to time. And in these phone calls that they get, they'll say, "Marc, I need you in Washington, D.C. this afternoon. We've got to do an intervention on my daughter tonight."
Yeah.
What do you do when a family in crisis is feeling that it's so frenetic and such a crisis that they want you to act right then and fly and do the intervention today?
Well, I have had those, and some of the time, the right response is doing the intervention the next day, or getting on the plane that night. But a lot of times, it's gaining the trust of the family and then slowing it down a little bit, because unless the person is in jail, in the hospital, or they're in some time-sensitive, compromised situation, I'm going to lean on let's do this smart. Let's really plan for this. Let's think this out. Let's say something to consider is that, and I was just talking to someone this morning about this. 20 years ago, if somebody went out or they were using, you didn't have fentanyl, and which is immediate, right? So, I mean, if you were a drug user or an alcoholic, yes, those things are going to kill you, but they're not going to kill you this afternoon. So you do have a little time. But when it comes to the drugs that are on the street today, time is of the essence. A good friend of mine says nobody has the luxury of a relapse anymore. But yeah, I've had times where I've flown down to Costa Rica. I came down to Houston once to collect a young woman who is getting out of prison. So those are things that were kind of time sensitive. But usually I like to work expedient, smart, but expedient. And I just want it to be do it the right way.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I've spoken to some interventionists over the years that will say, "I will never do an intervention on the same day. It's never that urgent because it's so important to have the family trained prior to the intervention." But I agree. I tend to so much more agree with what you're saying. Time can be of the essence, and you're
Yeah,
right. So many people, I don't think anyone really can afford a relapse because we
right.
don't know what they're going to relapse on and what's going to happen when that relapse happens. And so I have seen you in action and seen you in the field and have known you for a long time and know that you will turn on a dime and immediately run to the airport and get on a plane and fly away. And I
Yeah.
just think I commend that. I think it's important. And I also know that when you feel like there is time, that you'll take that time and educate as much as possible prior to. And so I think that's great. And the other thing I think is so important about an intervention is the book that you wrote, right? And it's a step-by-step guide for parents, right? And
Mhm.
it's how to do an intervention, a step-by-step guide for parents. I work with so many families and so many individuals around the world whose I'm going to stick with children right now, right? Adult children, right? Or adolescent and adult children who really run the family system, right? As an
Right,
addict.
right.
And they're kind of a hostage. They keep the family hostage. They're a terrorist sometimes.
Mhm.
And I think that this book is so important for families. Tell our audience a little bit about the book that you wrote and the importance of educating the family and the role of the parents or loved ones in an intervention.
Yeah, so, like I said before, and like you and I were talking before the show, it really is, I mean, the change has to take place with the family and the family system, the parents. And that's what the book really does. It talks about that and talks about some of the steps I take to prepare for an intervention. You know, like, so one of the things I talk about in the intervention is you can't, if you're going to do it yourself, you can't be both the parent and the interventionist.
Correct.
So I talk about, like, recruiting a family friend or your family pastor or your family rabbi to take that role, which is going to end badly for them anyway. um,
Yes.
but yeah, to do that role and how I do things, some of my philosophies on interventions, like I always do the interventions early in the morning. One, because we know where the person is, they haven't started drinking or using yet, and it gives us the upper hand. Um, I'm not a fan of uh, negotiating treatment with an addict. If they go to treatment and they're working and they're doing the work, and they feel like they'd be better off, we can have that discussion. But a lot of times manipulation is so sneaky, and I've had parents call me and they'll say things like, he just called or she just called and they're so glad they're in treatment and they've said, "You're right, I need to be here," and absolutely,
Yeah.
but this isn't the right place for me,
Yep.
right?
That's always,
And
yeah.
and that's a manipulation, right? And a big one that we all hear a lot is young adults and adolescents threatening to kill themselves, which is a really serious threat, because on one hand we always take that seriously, right? And we never know, and we have to be very careful. On the other hand, it is often used as a manipulation by young adults and adolescents, but you can't assume it is, but it is used, and as a parent, hearing that is going to stop you on a dime. It's going to is going to make you, yeah,
That's right. I see that practically every single day, just like you
yeah,
and I see every day, and things that you and I talk about, right? You know,
yes,
something I'd love to talk about is, and by the way, that does not only go for the adolescent or the young adult. You and I see that really, whether it's a husband and wife, whether it's a grandmother or grandfather, whomever the identified patient is that's actually in treatment, it's not age related that the
right,
person will call and say, thank you. I'm so glad I'm in treatment. This isn't the right place, right?
right,
So
right,
many people will say that. And so, you know, my advice is whether you're a parent or a husband or a wife or a spouse, and we'll talk about where to get your book later, but read Mark's book about a step-by-step guide for parents, and I'll say families,
mhm,
and learning more about an intervention and your role as that loved one, because it's so important to understand that the loved one is going to continue manipulating until
mhm,
you stop allowing the manipulation, right? Until you
yes.
do your own work.
And that goes to one of my strategies is I typically like to put people in treatment a little bit further away from home. So if they're here in South Florida, I want them to be in Houston. If they're in California, I want them to come to you. And the reason is because inevitably they're going to come up with, I want to leave. They're gonna want to leave against medical advice. They're
Yeah,
gonna want to try to run the show. So if we set some of these things up in advance, where there are these natural barriers, it's one thing if you're 20 minutes from home, they jump in an Uber and they go home.
yeah,
The other thing is if it's a plane ride away and they don't have money,
that's
the
right.
parents have the money, or different things you can do to kind of slow the roll and be able to intervene. But I do want to point out, and I think you'll appreciate this in the generation you grew up in and I grew up in, is young people today talk to their parents in a very different way than we talk to our parents.
Correct.
And, my daughter talks to me in a way that I would never talk to my dad. We're more, when she was born, one of the things I said is I never want her to be afraid of me.
Yep.
And let me tell you something, she's not. She's a great girl and she's doing great, but
Yeah,
we have a closeness that parents didn't have. So
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
You know,
there
Mark,
we go.
yeah, you worked in commercial real estate, which is a world away from interventions and
Oh,
and recovery, but you worked in commercial real estate for 20 years, both in New York and DC, and then you made a transition. Talk to me, and that's all a part of your story. So I'd
yeah.
love to hear about your story. And while before you do that, I'm going to throw one more thing out there to talk about because I know it's part of your story as well, and that is that at J. Flowers Health Institute, you know, I see a lot of Jewish families. We see
Mhm.
Jewish families from really all over the world that fly into Houston and work with J. Flowers Health. And what I've talked to you about, what I've talked to my Jewish friends about, and the community is that there is a lot of trauma and intergenerational trauma within uh, the Jewish world, of
Sure.
course, and I see in Jewish men in particular a high level of anxiety that's a consistent thread in the people with whom I work that are Jewish. And
Yeah.
so, and I know you don't mind me saying that you're Jewish,
Oh,
and so I would love to have you talk just a little bit about your story from commercial real estate into your recovery story, and then also that intergenerational trauma.
and a huge part of my story. So I was in commercial real estate for 20 years, probably about 17 years too long. I had some very good years. I had some very bad years, but the last few years, I just wanted to get out of it. And I had a good position with a small commercial real estate firm in Bethesda, Maryland, which is a suburb of Washington
Sure.
D.C. And I was just burnt out. And I would sit in my office and I'd run my fingers through my hair, saying to myself, "I got to get out of here. I got to get out of here." So I didn't know where it was, and I kind of on a whim, my wife and I decided that we were going to move to South Florida. We needed a change, and so we moved with our then 14-year-old daughter to South Florida, which to me, I weighed the moving from one of the most intellectual places in the country to a place that can be a little bit more loose, a little
Yes.
more free, right?
Sure. Yep.
So we got down here, and I promised myself that I'm done with commercial real estate. And I knew I've been sober long enough to know that this was a geographical, that we were doing a geographical. And I got down here and I promised that I wouldn't get into commercial real estate. And one of the first things I do is take a job at a commercial real estate firm, because not that I
Of
want it,
course. Yeah.
but
Yep.
it's what's familiar. And
That's right.
when we have fear, we default to the
It's what we
familiar.
know.
To what we know. And it's not as good as a job. It's not as good, everything is less than. And the first day I walk in there, I literally say to myself, what the F am I doing here? I have no intention of doing anything they've hired me to do. And in short order, was reverted back to running my fingers through my hair again. And now I'm saying, instead of I got to get out of here, I'm saying, if I don't get out of here, I swear to God, I'm going to kill myself.
Yep.
And I kind of fell into this spiritual crisis that lasted 3 or 4 months. And I remember being in the gym, in the shower, and having my palms out, and the water is hitting me. And I said to myself, well, I can't drink, I can't have an affair, and I can't kill myself. Those are the rules. Those are the things you can't come back. One of them you definitely can't come back from, and the other two would
Pretty
be pretty darn
difficult.
hard.
That's
That
right.
would be difficult too. They would be uphill climbs. And I went through this for a long time, and I really didn't see the answer, and I didn't know what to do. I look back now as I see those times as, that's when my higher power or God or your spirituality, whatever, is clearing the path to the next thing. And I was having dinner with my daughter, who was 14. We're sitting in the kitchen, we're having dinner, and she looks up to me and she says, Dad, why don't you start doing interventions?
At
Now, she
14, she
knew,
said that.
she said this, but she was familiar with interventions because I had participated in one for a friend a couple of years back, and was really intrigued. It started taking these certification courses and wanted to do something, but it was fear that kept pushing me back into commercial real estate. A deal that would come up, or this is the big deal, or that's the big deal. Those things that just pull us back. But she had known that. Her and I are very simpatico, and she said, Dad, why don't you start doing interventions? And it was like, at that moment, the weight of the world fell off my shoulders, and I knew that that was something that I could do, and I had the skills to do, and I had the knowledge to do. And literally that weekend, I just started writing out the business plan, and she helped me make a website. And I mean, the website's been done 4 times over since,
Sure.
but yeah, it was an incredible God moment and a miraculous moment in my life. And yet my situation felt so complicated, and the answer was so simple.
Yeah.
And
And,
it was amazing.
and sometimes we can't see the forest for the trees, right? It
Right.
was right in front of
Right.
you. And yet your 14-year-old daughter said, well, why don't you start doing interventions? And it became your
Yeah.
passion. And
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
something that you are absolutely brilliant and amazing at. And you're brilliant and amazing at so many things, but interventions is certainly one of your big passions in life. And you're obviously very successful at doing that at South Florida Interventions. How do people reach you, Mark, and learn more about interventions and talk to you about interventions or their family or something that they're going through?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because I just Googled myself yesterday,
I
and
love
I'm
that.
actually easy to find.
Good, good, good.
Yeah, so I'm sure we'll link it here, but my website is southfloridaintervention.com, and also they can reach me through the jflowershealth.com website.
Excellent.
But the other thing you asked about is intergenerational trauma,
Yes.
and this is something that took me years and years to appreciate. That I had my own trauma as a child that played a significant role in my life, that I would not allow myself to have And I always said, and I'm glad to tell you the story as we move through, but that incident of trauma was simply an excuse for weakness.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Flowers, if you had come to me and said I had and told me that you had the exact same experience, I would say, no, that's a real trauma. That means something,
Hmm.
right? But I wouldn't allow myself to have it. So, but as I started to understand trauma within myself and I understood it, I started to understand it through working with other people on their traumas and their history is that my story doesn't start when I was born. My story starts in 1904 when my father's father was dropped off at an orphanage in Poland.
Wow.
And it's easy to say if you don't understand it to say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Well, the attachment, the loss of his family, poverty, the lack of love that he received, both world wars,
Hmm.
right? And he had a brother that was with him that one night just left the orphanage, and he never saw him again.
Wow.
We never knew what happened to him. And then my grandfather went to Germany, and that's when he met my grandmother. Of course, they had to flee Germany, and they got to the United States in 1937, which was really just, with a minute to spare.
Yeah.
And they had a very hard life. But my father was born into this family in 1942, that they were all about survival. They didn't have the luxury of entitlement. They didn't
Hmm.
have the luxury of choice. And my father tells a story all the time of having to, in the summer, his mother would say, would take him and his sister to the pool, and they'd have to decide are they taking the bus there or back. They had to walk one way, they couldn't afford to go both ways.
Sure.
But my father grew up with a dad who was very angry all the time,
Hmm.
real repressed anger, did not like people, a yeller, hard to communicate with. And well, my father was a much, much better father than he was. He still had that trauma. He still grew up, underneath an abusive father, an emotionally abusive father. And when I was born in 1972, the Holocaust was only 27 years, had only been, World War II was over 1945, it had only been 27 years. And we're in 2024. September 11th was only 23 years ago, right?
Yeah.
So, and we still think about that every day.
Every day.
That's affected our lives. But those events just moved through the generations.
Yeah.
And in my whole entire life, I could feel that something wasn't right, that I had fear, I had anxiety, which you were talking about.
Hmm.
The I'm not, and also questions about myself, or I'm not good enough, and it's a funny thing because if you're like me, the day you discover drugs,
Hmm.
it's and I was a doctor shopper.
Uh-huh.
uh, I was a very sheltered addict, I have to tell you. I was strictly a doctor shopper. But it's not like you say, oh, this is horrible, I've discovered drugs. For me, I discovered a solution,
Yeah.
right? It's wow, where has this been my whole entire life? This is exactly what I'm looking for. And that began a 10-year,
That's
yeah.
yeah. Wow. So Mark, talk a little bit about your experience having a daughter and and the fact that intergenerational trauma is real. And just as you said, your story really begins in 1904 and it goes from generation to generation to generation. And it is truly passed down in our bodies, in our tissues, in our bones, in our brain, in our chemistry. And really,
And
uh,
our
and
behaviors,
our behaviors and the way that
yeah.
yeah. And so how did you make sure, and how are you making sure, and how will you families, or how can families make sure that that intergenerational trauma is treated early or looked at early for you, and it's, for instance, in your daughter's life, and how do you make sure that she lives a healthy, thriving life? And what do you do as a parent when you understand, as well as you do, that she probably suffers from some intergenerational trauma herself?
Yeah, for sure. We pass it down, and we unwittingly pass it down.
Sure.
I think the thing is, I have a saying that sometimes the best way to help another person is to work on yourself.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's true in the intergenerational trauma. And had at 30 years old, when I was born, my dad was 30 when I was born. Had he been working on that, had he been in therapy, had my mom been in therapy, she came from her own
Yeah.
situation as well. Had they been in therapy, really working on it, would that have made my life different? And the answer is yes. I mean, for a long time, I say, no, that has nothing to do. Again, if I were really smart enough and strong enough, that wouldn't
Hmm.
matter, but it does. Um, but look, in the early 70s, how many people were working on
That's
working on
right.
their PTSD, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Maybe
they were,
LSD, but not
yeah,
PTSD.
right. Which has now come back,
Yeah.
right? Is
Yeah.
now a subject again. But yeah, I think that, you've got to work on yourself. You've
Yeah.
got to, there's no way you can be there for someone else.
Mark, that's so true. Is I often heard in my family, the buck stops with me, right? Or it ends with me. And in my own family, which I've talked about on podcasts and in lectures and talked to you about, but coming from a family of addiction that passes through generations in my family, and then the trauma that my family has experienced, it's the same thing. If my mom and dad or my grandparents had done their own work, right? But they didn't do
Mhm.
that back then, right? Much
Right,
at
right,
all, right? They
right,
weren't in New
right,
York, and they didn't do psychoanalysis, right?
right.
they, so they didn't take care of themselves in that way. But for people like you and I in our generations, we understand that we can stop that intergenerational trauma, and we can do things for our own health to make us healthy and keep us healthy. And there's not a Tuesday that doesn't go by that I meet with my psychiatrist every morning, every Tuesday from 10 to 11 o'clock, basically. And it's so important that we do our own work. And for someone like you know,
Yeah.
I'm in the trenches every day treating people. You're in the trenches every day doing
Mhm,
interventions and talking about recovery and living
mhm.
a life of recovery. And your work can't be your recovery. You've got to do your own recovery work and your own therapy.
Right. So you do have to do your own work. Your work cannot be your recovery. But also, I think that work for me has come in many different forms over the years. I'm a huge fan of the 12-step programs.
Yep.
I love meetings.
Yep.
But I also, something that helps me is working out,
Yep.
being physical, that helps me a lot. Sleeping,
Yep.
is really important, and nutrition is really important. But, for me, I'm always very willing and very open, and this may be somewhat unusual. I'm always looking, and this could be some of my AA training, looking to see what's my role in this? Where have I participated in this? Or
Mm-hmm.
why am I taking this action? And one thing I'm a believer is nobody does anything for free. So, with parents that are enablers, and we were talking about this, for example, they get something out of that.
Absolutely.
There is some upside to it. And I'm not saying that they would intend to cause harm to their child. Of course they wouldn't, but they are getting something out of it. There is some reward, and that is, you know, the child may be very good at making the parent feel like when they do what he wants, like, oh, you're the best parents and you love me, and
Yeah.
you get that reward, and so, why do I do this? What do I get from it? Why do I constantly overeat?
Yeah.
Why am I overspending? What am I getting from it?
Yeah. That's exactly
What's the
right.
payoff here?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's right. Mark, another word that comes to my mind with you as we end this podcast today is what I want our audience to hear about you is I think this is one of the most overused words, but it's a word that I mean when I think of you, and that's authentic, and that you live an authentic life, and you project authenticity as a person, and you own your history, and you own your past, and you own your present, and you own your future, and you take care of yourself, and you do things to make sure that you are going to continue to be successful on your own terms, and whatever that success looks like for you and your family. And I just so much appreciate that and want to say thank you for doing this podcast. Thank you for being now a part of Jay Flowers, and thank you for all of the interventions that you're going to do to save so many people and place them wherever they need to be placed in this world.
And thank you for having me be part of Jay Flowers. That is, that's huge. And I would only have considered associating with a program that I truly look up to,
Thank you so much.
that I truly admire. And I've been meaning to tell you, so one little thing is I was having coffee with an interventionist last week, and we were talking about Jay Flowers, and he had heard either you or Claudia speak at a conference, and he said to me the note that he had written in his book was that flowers equals house, as in Dr. House.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. That if nobody else can figure it out, Dr. Flowers can. And that was literally the note he wrote in his book when listening to, I believe it was You Speak.
That just kind of gave me chills, and I appreciate you saying that. And while I don't claim to be the Dr. House and the Dr. House, that's what I feel every day. And I do not work. I just get up and live, and I love helping people, and I love helping solve puzzles. And that's what we do here is put a jigsaw puzzle together and find those missing components to help people live the best life possible and allow them to thrive again. So that makes me feel good. It validates
Yeah,
what we do. So
sure.
thank you for saying that. And everyone, you can find Jay Flowers Health at jflowershealth.com. Give me a call at 713-205-1493. And you can also find Marc Kantor at your website.
At southfloridaintervention.com, and my telephone number is 202-390-2273.
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening. And that's all for understanding the human condition today. And we'll see you again very soon. Thanks so much.